Hi, everybody. Today's Monday, September 1st, 2025, and our friend Colonel Jacques Baud is back with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you very much for inviting me again. Happy to be back.
Let me start, Colonel, with what has happened in the Middle East with the case of Yemen. Israelis attacked Yemen and killed the Prime Minister of Yemen together with his cabinet. And Houthis came out and said that this is a new sort of escalation. We're going to do the same to Israel. They have already attacked an Israeli tanker in the Red Sea. How can we understand the situation with Israeli mindset, with the way that they're thinking, the way that they're escalating the situation against Houthis? Because it's this was something new. We haven't seen this sort of. They attacked Iran. They wanted to assassinate the Iranian leadership. But the attack on Houthis, how is that going to influence the mindset in Yemen to fight against Israel?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that the Houthis are not an Iranian proxy, as people used to say. Yemeni are independent, they are sovereign, and they have their own policies and their own behavior. And what we can see also is that Yemen is, in fact, the only country that assumed that accepted the idea of the responsibility to protect towards the Palestinians. And I have explained several times that the responsibility to protect is, in fact, something that a principle of the United Nations that was adopted in 2005, based on the experience of the Rwanda war, where everybody witnessed the massacre or genocide that was happening there, but nobody dared or wanted to act. And the responsibility to protect, the principle of responsibility to protect, or R2P, this R2P principle was here to give an instrument for the international community to react to such situations. The R2P is based on three pillars, and that's what we can see on the UN website. For those who are interested, you can see the responsibility to protect and the three pillars. The first one is that every country, every state is responsible for the security and safety of its own citizens. Therefore, it has the responsibility to solve the problem inside of its own jurisdiction, if you want. The second pillar is the duty of the international community to assist a country in solving its domestic problem in order to protect its population. And this is, and when you, I continue. And then the third pillar is that when the two first pillars failed, there is an obligation of the international community to intervene in some way. That can be politically, that can be militarily, they can intervene in different ways. Now, if we look at the Palestinian case, Israel is responsible for protecting, very important, is responsible for protecting the Palestinians, because Israel is the occupying power. That applies both to the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, obviously, but also in other places such as the Golan, for instance. As occupying power, Israel is responsible for the security of those people, of the occupied people. Now, in Gaza, it's obviously not the case, and obviously we have the use of weapons that are definitely not there to protect population, but on the contrary, to maximize the number of victims and all that. And so that means that the first pillar of the R2P was not failed with Israel and Palestine. The second pillar The obligation of the international community to assist the government is basically, this is the whole instrumentarium of all the resolution, UN resolutions and condemnations done by various international organizations, including the International Court of Justice, for instance, that ruled that the occupation of the Palestinian territory, for instance, was illegal, and that the Israeli had to evacuate or to remove their resident, the Israeli resident, from those occupied territories. And all this second pillar failed also because the international community, I've seen the resolution, but it never made any effort to make those resolutions implemented by Israel. So now we are under the third pillar. And the third pillar is that you may have intervention. Now, the Yemeni decided to create an embargo, not an embargo, a blockade of Israel, in the Red Sea, up until Israel accepts a ceasefire, which is an absolutely legitimate objective, which is absolutely in accordance with international law. So all the actions of the Houthis in the Red Sea is perfectly legitimate and even legal, because their aim is not to destroy Israel. Their aim is to have a ceasefire, which is what the UN wanted, and so it's absolutely in accordance. So the problem here is that no other Arab country, with the possible exception of Iran, but again, it's not an Arab country, by the way, but besides this thing, Iran, there are other issues that are obviously at stake. And when you had this, the various exchange of missiles and drones between Israel and Iran last year, or in April, then in October, and then or November, and early this year in June, this was not directly related to the Palestinian situation. In fact, it was more a way for Israel to distract from the Palestinian situation, and in a way, in a move to escalate the conflict. So we are in something slightly different with Iran. But the Houthi.
But Colonel Netanyahu, he feels that Iran, if they can do something with Iran, they can collapse the whole axis of resistance. They can just destroy.
Yes, I know, but because again, this is a little bit the same type of rhetoric that you have with Ukraine against Russia. The problem is that the Israeli leadership, as the Ukrainian leadership, by the way, they are trapped into their own narrative, and they have created a narrative based on God knows what, and God knows what. Sorry, and this is not based on facts. This is also the idea, and that's the reason why I said to start that the Houthis were not a proxy of Iran. They have an independent policy. It's very important. And probably even the Iranians didn't want the Houthi at the beginning to strike Israel as they did, because it would complicate the relationship with Iran. Because, as you said, Israel is considering Iran as the keystone of the whole axis of resistance, which is not exactly true.
Can we say, Colonel, sorry for interrupting, can we say the same thing about Hezbollah in Lebanon? Because it seems to me the same way that Hezbollah is getting support from Iran, but they are independent in their decisions.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. It would be totally wrong to say that the Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran. This is something. This is a rhetoric of Israel. The Hezbollah was created after the Israeli invasion of South Lebanon in 1982. Hezbollah itself was formally created in 1985, and 3 years later. And we have seen in the various Israeli interventions in Lebanon that you have this network of tunnels and bunkers and strong points that were constructed. I mean, if you have an entity that wanted to attack Israel, they would not base on tunnels and things like this. You see what I mean? Those tunnels are obviously defensive structures. And that's what Israel wants to dismantle, because now they claim that the South Lebanon belongs to Israel. And they want to have a buffer zone there. And the international community is playing ball with Israel on that, which is quite surprising. But the Hezbollah has never, the Hezbollah has no territorial claims. They are not Palestinians. They have no territorial claim towards Israel. I mean, there are a couple, so it's a few square meters or probably kilometers, a couple of square kilometers, the Shaba farms and a few spots along the border that Israel has in fact stolen on the Lebanese territory. And the problem is that the Lebanese government is too corrupt and too weak to resist to the Israelis, and that's the reason why Hezbollah exists. It's not because of Iran. It's a self-defense structure, because the southern part of Lebanon is a Shiite. They are Shiite Lebanese, and they defend themselves because and even in 1982 I said that's what prompted the creation of Hezbollah. The thing is that in 1982 the purpose of the Israeli invasion was the PLO. So if I can summarize extremely simply, they were Sunni, the Palestinian who are not Shiite. And instead of playing with those, because the Shia in southern Lebanon were not happy about the presence of PLO, because there were more than 1 million people there, and that was obviously a problem, a burden for the local economy, a burden for the local infrastructures and all that. So the Shia were not so happy to have the Palestinians. And when the Israelis entered Lebanon, the Shia were welcomed the Israelis, in fact. But the Israelis, instead of using that, or exploiting the tensions within Lebanon, they didn't use that. They say, well, they were all Arabs, and again we are with this always the same thing. The Israelis have no roots. I underline twice, no roots in the Middle East. The 2,000 years and all that, this is just a fantasy. They have no roots. They are all Europeans. They are all coming from the Central Europe. I mean, Ukraine, Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary. This is the origin of the Israeli state. And the IDF and all that. So these people didn't understand anything at the societal dynamics that existed. And for that reason, instead of using the Shia in Lebanon, they shot at them. And that's what created the Hezbollah. And since then, in fact, the Lebanese government has never been in a position to respond to Israel. The Hezbollah did that, and the reason why the Lebanon is not able to respond to Israel is because it's too corrupt. While in the Hezbollah, of course, they're all Shia. They are all motivated with the same spirit, and the corruption is not a problem in that context, and therefore that's why they were more effective against the Israelis than the Lebanese army. So, but it's a defensive organization. This has nothing to do with Iran. It happened that they got the support of Iran in the early 80s because Iran was Ayatollah Khomeini wanted to trigger a movement against. It was kind of an anti-colonialist movement, in fact, that it triggered, based more on religion than politics or political ideology. But it was that. Therefore, they got support from Iran. But it's not. Hezbollah is a very Lebanese organization that has its own dynamics. They got support from Iran, but it's not. They don't apply the Iranian politics or policy. That's very important to. And with the Houthis, this is a very similar thing. They are very much independent. They have their own rationale and all that. Now, the Houthis, to come back to those, they have this quite effective and I would say quite impressive also action against Israel. And I say impressive because they were not deterred, not even by the Americans. You see, and that's something that is notable, because this is obviously other Arab countries are afraid of the Americans. But the courage of the Houthi is, in my view, an example, definitely, because they have no problem with Israel, basically. This is just this question. They were fighting against the injustice and the the absence of law of Israel, the absence of respect of international law by Israel, and lawlessness of Israel, and that's the rationale of the Houthi. Now, obviously, the Israelis, instead of trying to find a solution in the Middle East, and we see that they signed agreements that they never respect. It happened with the Hezbollah last year in November, when they signed the ceasefire with Hezbollah. They didn't respect any of the clause of this treaty. They signed, under the pressure of the Americans in February, a ceasefire with the Palestinians. They didn't respect either. So, and then, of course, when the Houthis came into the game, they didn't comply either. So the Israelis have a mentality that tends to escalate problems rather than to solve problems. And now they have apparently killed the prime minister of Yemen and a part of the ministers. And the Houthis are not afraid to escalate. And I think this is perfectly legitimate. You know, the Houthis have acted in the spirit of the international law, in reality. And they have done exactly what the Westerners do. I mean, when a policy of a country, when we don't like it, we apply embargoes or blockade or things like this. Think about Cuba, think about Venezuela, think about Iran. We do it. When others do it, we tend to qualify it as terrorism. You see? But in reality, the Houthis, well, today the word terrorism has lost all of its value, because everybody uses it just not to solve the problem, but to stigmatize somebody. Therefore, the Houthis have understood that, and that's why they have this policy of applying the R2P in their way, and that may lead to a situation where the Houthis may want, legitimately, and they said they would do so, to kill the Netanyahu or the people of the cabinet. And they will probably do it at one point. I don't know. Again, apparently the Israelis have now stepped up their security measures for the government. Now they are afraid. You know, they are not courageous. The Israelis have never been a courageous people. It's easy to be courageous when you're stronger than the other, you see. That's the way, that's the courage that is really demonstrated. The Houthis have demonstrated, and remember when they attacked the Americans, and the Americans had to make an agreement with them because they noticed that the Houthis were determined to continue the fight, and they were not deterred by the U.S. presence, despite all the U.S. attacks and things like this. So the Houthis are brave. These are brave people. They are ready to confront the international community, I mean the Western community, not the international, just the Western community, and obviously Israel, for the sake of justice. And I think that's something that is, in my view, commendable.
Carol, we've learned that the United States is moving its forces, weapons in Iraq to the Kurdish regions, and from the Arab regions to the Kurdish regions. It seems that something going on in the Middle East, and many people believe that Israel would attack Iran in the near future. And do you see any outcome, any different outcome for Israel? Because it's, what is if they're not going to get anything different from what they get in the first place, that they, with the first attack they had on Iran? What are they seeking for? I don't see Donald Trump getting that much involved in the war. I simply don't see that happening. And it will be supporting Israel in their fight, maybe some using fighter jets to help Israel, but nothing of there is no substantial change in what's going on in the nature of the conflict. If Israel is, I don't know what they're seeking for. What's your understanding of that?
Well, the problem here is that we are seeing irrational actors. Donald Trump is not exactly irrational, but he has an erratic rational. We can define it that way. So I'm not sure if he has a real strategy to address things, because it tends to impose the Pax Americana, we can say. So he tries to, through sanctions and tariffs and military pressure and things like this, try to impose solutions. But he provides no long-term and sustainable solution to problems. And obviously, he's not interested to engage in a conflict in the Middle East. That's probably true. But at the same time, we said the same thing in June, and he intervened nevertheless, because the pressure in the United States to fight Iran is enormous. And that's where you have the unknown factor, because even if Donald Trump doesn't want, he might be forced into a conflict simply because you have trigger-happy people such as Lindsey Graham, Richard Blumenthal, and Mitch McConnell, and others who are definitely wanting to have a general confrontation. These are also those guys who, in fact, they are not even in favor of Israel, because those are the so-called Christian Zionists who expect that Israel would disappear in order to have the new Messiah. We are in a very strange, again, we are in a very, with irrational actors on the American side. Irrational, or with a irrational approach to rationality or erratic rationality. And in Israel, we have, it's probably not totally irrational in the sense that Netanyahu has a policy of more war. He feels happy just with war. It's a kind of sociopathic type of behavior, in fact. He's a very dangerous person because he has no shame in sacrificing its own population for the sake of its own ambition. And most of the Israelis play ball with him. Let's be clear. 82% of the Israelis support the Netanyahu's policy towards the Palestinians. So you may have 18% of people who are ideologically against him, but in essence, you have here a population and a leadership who is irrational in many sense. Therefore, we cannot expect a rational calculation of how to win a war or things like this. They will certainly try to inflict more damage as possible, because that's the name of the game at the end of the day. They want to inflict most damages. Probably the Iranian, because the Iranians understand the Israelis much better than the Europeans do understand the Israelis. And the Iranians understand the Israelis much better than the Israelis understand the Iranians. That means that so far we can say in the various missile exchanges we had last year and this year, that even if they were not, we cannot speak about decisive victory or things like this because of destruction or the victory or the sense or the defeat, let's say, probably not the victory, but the defeat was very evident on the Israeli side. Israel was defeated because Israel never expected that Iran could respond in a such effective way. So regardless of the level of destruction or the number of casualties, by the way, the Iranians are able to respond without making casualties, while the Israelis are not able to do that. And that also explains or shows that the Iranians are much more able to plan operations. They have a more thorough strategic planning than the Israelis. The Israelis are just destroying everything. That's the name, destruction. It's not a country that has built anything. It's a country that has destroyed things since it is there. You know, this idea that they make plants growing in a desert, that's just a rhetoric. In reality, Israel has more destroyed than constructed. And that will continue that way. Iran understands that it can engage a war with measured effects in order to, let's say, escalate, to have a control of the escalation. It's controlled escalation, if you want. Israel has not this idea. They will strike everything in one, and they will not be able to escalate. It is not. They don't have a strategic approach. They have a kind of a tactical approach of the conflict that has strategic dimension, but it's not strategic per se. And that's exactly what we may have. Now, the Iranians understand the Israelis. They understand that the Israelis would certainly not stop their attempt to destroy Iran or the leadership of Iran or whatever in Iran in June. Therefore, they probably stepped up their defense, stepped up their ability to strike Israel, and probably, I mean, I don't know. Again, I'm not Iran, and I said they have this ability to control escalation, meaning that they will probably much wiser than I am, because I would say that in such a situation, probably one could estimate that in order to have peace in the region, you have to flatten Israel, because this is the only country that has created conflict. So you may come to this kind of thinking. I hope it's not the case, but given the fact that Israel has been incapable to uphold the treaties it signed, were not able to abide by international law in any situation, that even try to justify the most terrible crimes by lying, by perception management, and all that. It never stopped to attack its neighbors. Recently, an Israeli minister, said that Jordan belonged to Israel. They said recently that south of Lebanon belongs to Israel. They have said to Syria that Syria belongs to Israel. So there is a point where if you add all this, you would come to the conclusion that the only way to stop an irrational enemy is to destroy him completely. If you put in the equation that you can rationalize the dialogue, probably that's not the solution. And in fact, all those who try to rationalize the dialogue with Israel, especially Yasser Arafat, for instance, in the late 80s and 90s, with the Oslo Accords and all that, when they tried to have a rational relationship with Israel, they say that it doesn't work. Israel never respected what it signed. They never felt bound by what was signed. We have seen, obviously, since October. And remember that what happened in October 2023 is not the start of something. It's the consequence of what happened before. In fact, it's just the last drop in the bucket that make the whole thing, that create this overflow. And the situation had become so intolerable for the Gazaouis or Gazians that they had to do something. And that's where the 7th of October comes into the game. So the 7th of October was the consequence of Israeli policy, not the start of a new policy by Hamas or whoever. And that's very important to understand, but Israel will refuse to understand that. Therefore, we are in a situation that you cannot solve with rational arguments. And I think now a lot of people understand that. And that has become very apparent with the way the Israelis tried to solve the problem in Gaza. And I think the Iranians have understood that. Now, how they will react if they destroy Israel, that it's very, I cannot imagine that the Americans would do nothing if they destroy Israel, to be honest. Despite everything that Donald Trump said and his intent not to engage in new conflict and things like this, I think if Iran respond massively to Israel, the Americans will try to respond. And probably others will respond too, because we have this attempt from the Europeans to add new sanctions on Iran, and nobody really understands what's the purpose of the Europeans in doing that. And probably it's because they want to create a situation in which that gives them a good reason to intervene militarily and things like this. That's probably true, by the way. I don't know, but that's probably true. So we are in a situation that is extremely dangerous because it's driven by the irrationality of the Israeli leadership, and I would also almost say this kind of self-destruct type of mentality that the Israelis have. It's fascinating to see the Israelis were, in fact, after the recent exchange of missile we had in June, some people in the Israeli officials said that they expected 5,000 fatalities in Israel. But the Iranians were, in fact, much more subtle, and they responded in a very targeted way on very specific targets, thus minimizing the number of fatalities. But that surprised the Israelis because when they started to attack Iran, they knew there would be a reaction, and they were ready to sacrifice 5,000 Israelis. You see, so that indicates that the Israeli leadership is extremely irrational. In addition to the fact that we have said that many times, Iran has never pledged to destroy Israel or to occupy Israel, and even if they would destroy Israel, we don't know exactly why. You see, there is no really a real problem. In fact, besides the accusation of Netanyahu, who says that Iran has a nuclear weapon, which, by the way, you could say Pakistan has a nuclear weapon or India has a nuclear weapon. We know that Iran hasn't, but Netanyahu claims they do. Why is that more a problem with Iran than with others? The problem also here, and that's where we have kind of a chain reaction here, because the reason why Netanyahu takes Iran as his best enemy is because Iran is already the enemy of the US. Would the US have good relation with Iran? That would remove every reason for Israel to attack or claim anything against Iran. But for the Americans, since 1997, when you had the US embassy occupied by those students, that was the ultimate, how to say that, humiliation for the Americans, and they never pardoned this, and therefore the Americans, Iran will remain an enemy. The Americans have not been able to rationalize the whole thing. Again, we are also in America, not just, we talked about Trump, but even before him, there were never a rational approach to the conflict with Iran. The Americans have always considered, since 1979, the US has never accepted Iran as a possible partner. The door is closed. And this is a little bit childish, because if the Americans would stop this stupid policy of sanctioning and imposing their law everywhere, the life would be more easy everywhere. That applies. We could see that with China and all this, because in most of the cases, this kind of behavior of the US is based on false assumptions. You see, we have seen that with China, we have seen that with Russia, we have seen that with Iran, and we see that it's totally based on fake assumptions. The idea that Iran has a nuclear bomb, and even when the US intelligence say, well, there is no nuclear bomb in Iran, you have the president who say, I don't care what the intelligence say, they do. This is beyond rational. How can a modern state be so irrational? We are back to the Middle Ages with those guys. They have a total irrational type of thinking. I mentioned Trump, I mentioned McConnell and others, all these guys. They are inspired by God, period. They feel to be inspired by God, because I'm not sure that God would agree to destroy a country. But that's another topic.
It's a delusional sort of. Carl, I think one of you're talking about the irrationality of the mindset in the West. One of the latest one is their move on India. They tried to put 50% tariffs on India. They felt that they can do something with India in order to put pressure on Russia. The new summit, the SCO summit, shows totally different reality of what's going on and how the leadership in the West, I'm talking about not about Europeans, but also about the United States, they're somehow feeling that they're in a position to put pressure on each and every country and bring them to their knees. But it doesn't seem that would be the case anymore. You see Putin, Xi, and Modi coming together and the way that they're talking to each other. It's a whole different atmosphere, what's going on. And I don't know if the West understands what's going on there.
Well, in fact, I think the mental posture of the West has remained 50 years ago. I mean, this is probably, you could have had this kind of behavior 50 or 40 years ago when the rest of the world, as we call it, was not so developed technologically and had not so much political, industrial, economic, and scientific capabilities. And therefore, it was easy to impose the Western view on the rest of the world. That's why we did since World War II up to a few years ago, in fact, because we had the technology, we had the know-how, we had the democracies, we had this, we had that, and we could easily convince others that we were the engine of the world. But with the emergence of China, especially, and in the next future, you will come, India will come after that. I mean, what we have seen with China at this stage is that China has become the engine of the world. And the world now, I mean, after World War II, the Western world depended on the US for a lot of, I mean, economically, but also industrially and all that. Today, the world, not just the Western world, but the world depends on China in many ways. I mean, we mentioned the rare earth and all that, but also in terms of research and development and. And in addition to that, we have seen since the early 2000s in the West an extreme irrational behavior, making wars all over the world. I mean, in the Middle East, and all wars that they lost. Notably, I think it's important to mention that they have engaged into war that they lost. They created chaos. They created this migration that today is a problem in the West. But that was created by the same people who wanted to intervene in Syria, Afghanistan, and things like this. I mean, the Brits are crying today because they have too much immigration. The Germans are crying. Where do the migrants who are the problem today, where do they come from? I mean, they come from Afghanistan, they come from Syria, they come from all the country they try to invade, they try to destabilize, they try to destroy. And now, because life is impossible in the countries where we have been involved, life is impossible, therefore people come where life is possible, meaning in the West. So we created our own problems because of the lack of anticipation. And I think that's something people have very hard time to identify today, even in the West. Nobody, for instance, when we see in Brussels, you have people killed every day by gangs fighting each other. You have the drug trade has taken overwhelming size, and it's become a real problem for the Belgian authorities. And of course, you have a lot of immigration there in this country. But interestingly, they see the problem that you have the killings and things like that, the shootings, but nobody tried to understand why did that happen so. Nobody questions the policies that we applied, the foreign policies that we had, that in fact led to the situation we have. And because nobody questioned those policies, we repeat them. Because there is no self-critical approach to those foreign policies, and therefore we repeat them constantly. We continue trying to destabilize people. And and now what we in Europe are unable to identify, to explain, and to solve, the rest of the world has perfectly understood the way it works. And therefore they try to take distance from the West, because the West has become toxic. We have become toxic for the rest of the world. And that's what prompts, in fact, the dynamics we have seen in the BRICS, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as you just mentioned, because they are just closing their meeting today, I think, in China. In any case, this dynamics that is driven by countries such as Russia, China, and India, who are not who have very dynamic economies, who are successful. They spend a lot of money in research and development. They are developing new technologies, and in fact, they are developing the technologies we are no longer able to develop in the West. You see, Southeast Asia is the place where software is developed mostly. Semiconductors, now the leading area is China. I include Taiwan, but because it's part of China formally. But in any case, even Taiwan understands that its interest is no longer to play ball with the US. And when you see the problems that the TSMC has to build its plants, production plants in Arizona, in the US, I mean, they feel that this is just an investment for nothing. So the project doesn't work very well at this stage. And probably will have at one point, and we see that already in Taiwan itself, a lot of people question this idea of independence and all that. And finally, at the end of the day, they have a good relation with China. They have a lot of trade with China, mainland China, I mean. So why should they try to find topics and issue for confrontation if everything works well? You see, and you will have this kind of behavior developing because the East, or the Eurasia, I would say, is successful, as opposed to the West, who has crumbling economies, crumbling societies, crumbling everything. You see, and not even technological development is made in the West today. It originates in the East, and Japanese start to understand that. Koreans start to understand that. The only thing that keeps those countries with the West is political pressure, or even military pressure. See, and money. We buy them. But there will be a point where those people understand that it's not enough to be bought by the West. The West is not worth being with them, and that's the evolution we are witnessing. The problem here is this is a normal evolution, because definitely China has always been in the history a leader in technological development. They developed paper well before the West, the Europe did. They developed artillery and explosive well before the Europe did, and so on and so forth. So this is China has always been a place where innovation came. It was not always, let's say, publicized, or it was not even understood in the West, but in the East, it's well known. In any case, it's normal that China will regain the position it used to have in the past. And that's what you are witnessing today. The problem is here that the West has not been able to anticipate this, to identify the rise of those powers, has done as if it would never happen. And today we are surprised to see that we have Modi, Xi Jinping, and Putin meeting together and trying to enhance their mutual cooperation and all this. But everything could be detected well before, anticipated. We could have adjusted our foreign policies, or trade policies, or relationship, or diplomatic relationship with those countries in order to not to fight against that, because that's the sense of history. So you don't need to fight against history, but to go along with this evolution and take advantage of that evolution by simply being in the sense of history. You see? And we are not able to do that because, again, we are stuck in our narrative. We are stuck in this idea that we are the only one who have the truth. We are the only ones who have the right understanding of democracy. And it's very interesting to see that when you look at the there is a German organization that it's an NGO or think tank, I don't remember. In any case, they make every year a study. It comes every year. That's a survey on the democracy perception index. There's a democracy perception index, and in 2002, what we see is the country where the perception index was the highest. I mean, the perception index is calculated between it's the difference between the perception of the individuals that they would like to be in democracy, and the way they feel democracy in their country. And when you make the delta between those two opinions, then you have the PDI, so the DPI, sorry, the Democracy Perception Index. That means that when you have the lowest difference between what you assume is the perfect democracy and what you feel in the country. And the lowest, I mean, on the top of the list, if you want, China. That in 2022, the perception index, I mentioned that in one of my books, the highest level of democracy was in China. That's where the people perceive that there's the less difference between what they expect from democracy and what they receive from the government. Just after that, you had Switzerland. No real surprise, because obviously the system works differently, but it was the second, not even the first one. And well below, you had countries like France, Germany, Belgium, etc. It's fascinating. That was in 2022. It may have changed because, again, I'm not. It probably changed over every year. So, but in 2022, China was the most, where the idea of the perception of democracy was at the highest in the world. Meaning that when we try to impose a system, probably, I mean, obviously.
Come on, by the way, achieving that is unbelievable in China with the population, with the size of the population they have. To create this sort of feeling among people.
Yes, well, the thing is that the sense of democracy is obviously when we look at the word democracy, we tend to understand where you have a rule of law with decision making that is very much based on population and all that. So in Switzerland, as an example, we vote for everything. Everything is we vote for our taxes, we vote for everything. Therefore, the decision made at government level, they should reflect these the opinion of the population, and that's probably the traditional understanding of the word democracy, where people can decide their own fate based on, and that will give the basis for the policy of the government. And that's the traditional understanding. But you may have other perception. That's exactly what's happening in China. The problem is when you have even one party, the Communist Party, which is per se not a sign of democracy because you don't have this plurality. But at the same time, when this party can feel exactly what the population wants and make sure that the population gets what it wants, that means that for the population, yes, they were not asked for things. Yes, they could not decide them by themselves what the government does and makes and decides. But at the same time, if the government has enough sensors in the population to adopt policies that are adjusted to what the population wants and needs, then people feel that's democracy. Because at the end of the day, the whole system works in accordance to what the citizen expects. So it's a different approach to democracy, but that requires, obviously, that you have an extremely wise government. You have an extremely wise one-party system. That there is a lot of requirements, and apparently it works in China. If you look at it from an academical point of view, it doesn't look like a democracy. And I'm not saying that this is a democracy, but the perception of the people is that it's democratic because all their needs, requirements are fulfilled by the government. So there is nothing to complain about. When you have countries like France, where everybody is always complaining about everything, you have definitely not a perfect democracy. In fact, France is a monarchy, but it's an electoral monarchy. France, it's something different. But in any case, we see that none of the requirements of the population is fulfilled. The government does what he wants and doesn't take any consideration for what the population looks for. That's the reason why France is very low on this democracy perception index every year. China is always in the top tier. So the problem here is not so much who has the better DPI or things like that, but the thing is that we always try to teach people how they should be. You see, we cannot accept the fact that the Chinese is probably happy the way it is.
Yeah.
You see, and that's I think is very important. At the end of the day, they may not have the perfect system, but if they are happy with that system, why should we intervene to change that system? That's the problem. And again, I said that very often to my French colleagues also. I said, well, if as a Swiss, if I look at France is a dictatorship. If I look at it with Swiss eyes, it has none of the features that you would expect in a democracy. Therefore, a Swiss could decide to topple the government in France and change it. Of course, Switzerland will not do that, and we are too small to do it. But why entitles us try to change governments. If the French are happy that way, that's their business. I mean, I wouldn't, but if they are happy, that's their problem. And if the Chinese are happy the way they are, well, so be it. Why do we try to change it? And I noticed that when I was in Africa, I spent several years in Africa, and because of the nature of my work, I was not in the main city. I mean, not always in the main cities, but mostly in the remote areas where you have wars and conflicts. But in many places, I noticed that communities can live very peacefully. And there are systems at community level who are very far away from what we expect from an ideal democracy. But they're happy that way. And sometimes you can ask yourself, who am I trying or wanting to change that? They have their way of living. This is the way they were educated. That's the way it works. That's the way they interact. Why should we try to change that? The Swiss, I mean, even the Swiss model, which could be considered as probably not perfect, but let's say a good system for democracy.
Yeah.
It's probably not applicable.
It's the best representation of the democracy in the West. Yeah.
Yes, we can say that way. Even if today this democracy has it's not as it used to be, but in any case, let's say it's a good approach to democracy. Let's put it that way. But that is also the result of a culture. That's the result of our history. This is the result of an education. This is a result of the behavior. Swiss people tend to be peaceful. We don't try to antagonize people and things like this. And therefore, we accept other language. We live with 3 national languages. Even in Belgium, 2 languages is almost impossible. They are antagonized even with 2 languages. In Switzerland, we have 3, even 4, I could say, languages, and we can live peacefully with that. We understand each other. We learn. We understand. I mean, semantically, linguistically, but also we understand intellectually people. We accept different understanding, different culture, different that's history. It would be an illusion to export the Swiss model to France, for instance. That cannot work. You see, when I talk to my French colleagues and Italian colleagues, when I say that in the Swiss army, Switzerland has no professional army, so we used to have all our military gear, including rifle, armament, and ammunition at home. So every citizen, when he goes his military service, comes back home with its full military gear, NBC suit, combat suit, everything, plus its assault rifle and ammunition for that. And he keeps it at home. Yeah, when you say that in Italy or in France, they would say, well, if you would do that in our country, you would have a revolution the next day. You see? And that's probably true, by the way, because all that is the result of a culture. What I mean with this is not that the Swiss are perfect, but this is the result of a history and a culture. And every country has its own culture and history. They are used to that. Whether it's good, bad, whether it's, this is not the problem. This is their way. And we should have the intellectual honesty to accept the way they are. And if they need an improvement, they will improve, as we had to improve. I mean, Switzerland was created in 1291. It has evolved since then. We had wars, we fought against each other, we had battles, we had all that, revolution, we had all that during the more than 700 years. and we have this country today, as it happened in other countries. You have the same thing, the same history. The history of a country or society is made of constant adjustments and readjustments, and let them do that. Why should we provoke that? Why should we have people, special forces, special services trying to subvert governments by promoting terrorism and things like this? I mean, you have countries like UK, France, and the US who promote terrorism. These countries promote, fund, and create terrorism. Not even mentioning Israel, because that's almost a synonym when we talk about. But why that? Why do we need that? All these countries are, regardless of the type of government, they would be very happy to trade with us. And what's the problem? Why should we have a problem trading with country X, Y, or Z, regardless of the government they have? You see, this is the problem. We have not, we don't have the wisdom in the West to understand that. As a result, we get surprised by what's happening in Eurasia. I mean, the rest of the world at large. The sanctions or taxes or tariffs that have been applied to Brazil is a good example of how the West misbehave simply because of domestic issue in Brazil. The US applies sanctions and tariffs, and the same applies to India. You ask this question, and for India, it's clear that because of the size of the economy, because of the challenges within India itself, with a very poor population and the need to develop an economy in a situation with in a social framework which is not very rich, then of course trading oil with Russia is a lifesaver somehow. So, and that's exactly what Jay Shankar explained recently. He said, well, if you're not happy with that, just go to somewhere else. We don't care. We have our national priorities. We develop our domestic policies. We want to develop ourselves, and we have our relationship with Russia or whoever based on these priorities. Now, who are you, the West, to impose us trade partners or prices on raw materials and oil material and things like this? You know, this is this Western arrogance that is reminiscent from this old colonial past that we had when we remained at this situation in which the West was deciding everything everywhere. This is no longer the way. Again, we are now surpassed by China in almost everything. Because instead of waging wars all over the world, they invested in research and development. They invested in education. We have the educational system that we have in the West is crumbling. In the US, you have barely people who can, I mean, besides those who come out of the huge, these big universities, the rest is barely understands the world and probably not even can read. And we have the same problem in the West. I mean, in France, in Belgium, a lot of people can't even read or write their own language. I mean, so we are, and don't even mention arithmetics or things like that. People are not able to add two numbers. They have a cell phone for that today. So, meaning that the relying exclusively on cell phone to run an economy means that the overall intellectual level of the society collapse, and that's exactly what we have. And therefore, what we are witnessing today in Europe is not just the consequence of misguided policies that we had after the February 2022 with the Russian special military operations, but it reflects also the misguided policies we had since at least 25 years, because we spend all our money making wars all over the world for nothing. I mean, for disrupting societies, and today we pay the price. I mean, look at Sweden, look at Germany. Germany, when Angela Merkel, when you had these events in Syria, that was that were in fact created by the West, because we created that situation in Syria, destabilizing the Syrian government and all that, thus creating all this flow of refugees we had in 2015, 2016, and so on. All these people coming in Germany, and Angela Merkel said even this famous expression, "Wir schaffen es." That means we can do it, to absorb these people. I mean, 1 million refugees or things like this. But today they are paying the price for this, because when you have 1 million people coming, that changed also the software of the society. The whole rationale of the society changes, not simply because you have another culture coming, but also because the relationship between people also change. Because when you have a massive influx of people coming from outside with a total different mentality, different type of way of thinking and all that, that change also that creates let's say the fundament for communitarism. I don't know if the word exists in English, but this idea that you isolate groups. Groups tend to isolate from each other, and you create societies within the society. That's exactly what you have in France, for instance. And when you have a society within the society, it becomes very difficult to have an homogeneous and harmonious development, because then this minority society in your society tends to take too much space. And you see that in Sweden. Now they are trying to get rid of all those migrants they got in 2007, 15, 16, 17. These were because of the misunderstanding of what's happening in Syria. In fact, what they received in those countries, that means Germany, Sweden, and all that, these were the extremists. These are those people who fed the jihadists, who were chased by the Syrian government, and of course they fled to the West, and they came to Sweden. So Sweden didn't get the best of the Syrian society. They got all the extremists that were not willing to stay in Syria, because in Syria they were threatened. And now Sweden is experiencing exactly that. This is this totally misunderstanding of the situation. And that is something that is very striking. Again, I've said that many times, and as my title stays on the screen, you see former intelligence, strategic intelligence. The purpose of strategic intelligence is precisely to detect that, to warn the government, to explain the government what the situation is. So what we see today in Germany, in Sweden, in France, and others indicates that their intelligence services are definitely not up to the mark. They are incapable. They are incapable of assessing the situation. They have been incapable of assessing the situation as it was, and now they are surprised, and now they're they're biased and poor as the assessment they made at the time has now converted into security problems, domestic security problems in those countries. So we are exactly there. This inability to anticipate problem, to understand the thing as they are and not as we wish they would be. You see, that's exactly the problem, and that's explain exactly why the West now is collapsing, because we have now cut ties with all these people, with China because it's a dictatorship, with Russia because it's a dictatorship, with Modi because it's a dictatorship, although because they support dictatorships, and of course Iran and all that. This is the opposite. If we would have an influence in those countries, if we would help these countries to develop in a harmonious way, we should, on the contrary, have better relationship with them, have normal trade relationship, treat those people as normal people, accepting that they might be different. And if they need to change, they will change. People are not stupid. We know, I mean, you come from Iran. Iran has a population that has always traditionally been extremely West-oriented. But now they hate the Westerners because the Westerners are always trying to disrupt, destroy the country, so they don't like us. But culturally, the Iranian society is very much West-oriented. And that applies to everybody, to all that applies to the leadership, as to they are not adverse to the West. But since the West tries all the time to topple the government, to destroy and to support blindly Israel in policies that nobody could explain, because nobody could explain why Israel wants to destroy Iran. There is no rational explanation for that. But we stick to these ideas. We continue to support Israel in irrational policies, and therefore we are not able to understand how these societies develop, especially the Iranian one.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Carl, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much.